So as you might remember, I changed up the agenda here a bit, that we ran the two panel conversations together and moving what had been a keynote conversation between them into this spot in conclusion. In part, that was based on a conversation that Professor Tellis and I had in Washington, D.C. just last week. We were able to get together at the brand new offices and administrative building for Johns Hopkins' new building in downtown Washington, D.C., which occupies what used to be the Newseum. Now it's a nice, beautiful academic facility.
Baronial, I think, is the word.
Yes. No, I think that's quite well said. So rather than starting with a conversation meant to contribute, we're now using this as an opportunity to reflect back on, try to pull some threads together from what I thought have been two terrific panel conversations in the keynote by Ralph Mangual. And for our panelists who are still here and others, let's give a round of applause to them, and some great conversations thus far. And we hope to continue that momentum here. I am joined by Dr. Stephen Tellis, who is a senior fellow at Johns Hopkins University, friend of the program at the School of Public Policy, prolific writer and researcher on issues of social science across a variety of different interests and disciplines. And maybe I'll just kick some things off with,
Sure.
To bring it back to the James Q. Wilson and George Kelling origins of this conversation. You wrote what I thought was really one of the more beautiful tributes to Jim Wilson at his passing now about a decade ago, in which you noted Wilson's ability to understand social science research as the difference in approaches between lumpers and splitters. And it seems like the conversations today, both starting with the keynote, but also the first panel and the second panel, was really trying to look at the uniqueness of communities in which public safety, policing, policies are being implemented, and the importance of understanding. I'm thinking back on Professor Goodno's points in that first panel about understanding the different public safety needs and concerns in different communities. And then hearing this last panel just about things like street racing. Well, Santa Monica, where I've lived, street racing is becoming a thing, but it's by and large not a big thing, but in other communities it is. First, talk a little bit about how you differentiate lumpers and splitters and why that is important for this conversation around policing.
Yeah, so it's an interesting question because I was thinking what I wanted to say about this piece and going back and actually reading the piece. So I was trained by a group of political theorists known as Straussians who teach you to do close reading of texts, right? And also to remember that the stories people have told about texts are not necessarily the thing that's actually in them. And I think that's very much true of this piece, right? It's important to remember, in part, right, that a lot of this piece is actually derivative of work that Wilson had done earlier in Varieties of Police Behavior, right? Which is a classically Wilsonian book. Also, in some ways, a very weird book. I taught it actually not that long ago to my graduate students, and it was like it was coming out of another world, right? In some ways, right? In part just about that there are parts where Wilson is incredibly casual about things that everyone would like go for a trigger warning for today, in some cases for good reasons, right? But the technique of Varieties of Police Behavior is literally splitting, right? It's basically saying here are different styles of policing, what generates those different styles of policing, what are the consequences of the different styles of policing. There's not a thing called policing, right? That's the lumper versus splitter point. And in some ways, again, when I went back and looked at this article again with fresh eyes, one thing that strikes you is, right, it's not equally good at everything it does, right? So we should all be honest about our heroes, right? And Jim was very much my hero. But the best parts of this are the parts about order maintenance, and order maintenance for its own sake, right? As a good in and of itself, right? That is a thing government can do that's important for human flourishing, right? And then there's a pivot in the middle of the article where then it pivots to saying, oh, right, and there's actually a fair amount of information there, right? The whole thing starts with an evaluation report, right? So they, some people went out and they did evaluate, and so he's got a rich description of that, right? And then it pivots and he goes, well, and order maintenance is probably very important for crime reduction, right? And at that point, it gets very abstract and ideal typey, and you stop seeing much like evidence provided about the connection. And so one thing I would simply say is, if I'm going to be a splitter about Jim, right? This thing is better on the one thing than the other, right? And again, I think if there's a lesson, right? There's this concept that comes out of varieties of police behavior, which is very much alive in this, which is the concept of that police, a lot of what they do is what Jim called handling the situation, right? Which is a thing, which is police very much in their order maintenance mode, right? They're not really driven by law, right? They're driven by something, right? They're constrained by something, right? The thing they're constrained by is some perception of what the normative order that they're supposed to enforce is, right? That's what it means to handle the situation. Now, there's a whole question about where do they get that from, and I actually think that's in part wrapped up in race and lots of other stuff. But a lot of it comes out of this, again, earlier Peter was saying, the community is this super vague concept, right? And it's an incredibly vague concept, except, right, in the sense that we might say subjectively in the mind of the officer who's handling the situation, right? He may have a fairly precise conception of what he thinks the community is, right? And again, I'm just going to do now do like a close reading of Peter's talk, right? One of the other things he said is, right, that one of the problems with the community is, even if we can define it geographically, right, the police are not equally responding to everyone in that geographic space, right? Again, as I understand the concept, which is much better developed in varieties of police behavior, when they're handling the situation, they're responding to what they take to be the orderly component of the community, right? That every community has an orderly component and potentially a disorderly component, and their job is not to respect all of the community, it's to respect whatever they take to be the source of legitimate authority, right? But
isn't it something else, though, Stephen, as well? I mean, I took some of what Peter was saying as well as what David was saying, and I'll just combine a little bit what Naomi was saying, that there's also this cultural context, which, to put a way of defining it, says that stuff won't work here in Calabasas, right? There's a view of a community which is not just the physical infrastructure, but it's the cultural and historical infrastructure that can be supported by police. Doesn't necessarily have to be maintained by what might be called physical structures, but is a way of understanding. I'll tell a quick story on this. So I do a lot of public engagement training contracted by the California Police Chiefs Association. And I do a quarterly session with about 25 or 30 police chiefs. And the last session we did was 3 weeks ago in Monterey, was mostly cops from up in that region. And one of the police chiefs, the question that I asked was, how does your community's history and culture determine how you practice your work as a law enforcement officer? And one of them was the assistant police chief for Placerville, California. Now, the out-of-towners might not know that Placerville is a suburb of Sacramento. It also happens to have the nickname of Old Hangtown. Now, it's called Old Hangtown because as history, or maybe fabled history, says that back during the gold rush days, before there was an official police department for Placerville, they hung 3 bandits over the course of 2 years. Now, that set of events is such a part of the identity of the community, and I know you're going to find this difficult to believe, but in the town seal of Placerville is a tree branch and a noose hanging off of it. You might imagine this ran afoul a couple years ago. And it did. There were activists that came in. But the point that the officer was making is that this is actually part of our identity. That even though something happened 170 years ago, we take the law seriously here. And I just wonder to what degree some of the discussions that we're having around broken windows and kind of formal structures of policing and practices and even law, how those should be situated around community mores that develop over time and maybe based on actual historical precedent.
So one, again, I want to make a fairly blunt thing that huge amounts of what we've been talking about have nothing to do, at least with broken windows as understood by this article, right? A lot of it may be very good and very good ideas, right? But like many of them, like I don't think CompStat has anything to do with broken windows, right? That is, I think CompStat actually was an incredibly important innovation, right? But partially, right, there's the actual article that has an actual set of arguments, right? Mm-hmm. And then there's like a totemic thing that we talk about, lots of stuff that's just being like, everything people did in New York, and they poured it under this thing. And it's important, I think, to put the thing back in the box, just for analytical, precision, because it is a different thing than some of these others, right? CompStat was a very powerful tool of central control of an organization, right? Yep. That is when you think, and again, Peter may have a different view of this, but one view of what the New York police was, right, really up in the 70s was, in some sense, it was a really quasi-feudal organization, right? That where the precinct level was the real locus of organizational sort of mass, right? And there was very little central control. And in part, that was one of the reasons for corruption, right? Is this was not a very tightly centrally controlled organization. And CompStat was a mechanism of actually getting that, to focus at the precinct level to say, no, this is what you're supposed to be doing, and this is what you're supposed to be focused on, right? And it wasn't a mechanism to control corruption, but it was a mechanism to have some central control where the organization was relatively weakly central control before. That is not broken windows policing, right? Just to go back to your point, I understand broken windows policing to say it assumes that there is a moral order in that community, right? Mm-hmm. Wherever it comes from, and it varies, and it determines, people have very different ideas of whether drinking on the stoop violates that moral order. People have very different ideas of whether smoking weed in the park violates that, right? There's lots of parts of California where that is not, I don't have to tell you this, right, is not viewed by even the sources of order as a particular problem, right? But in this notion, right, the police are supposed to somehow discover that, or they're supposed to discover what that very local moral order, and that's where the comparison to the idea of eyes in the street. Yep. I think this article also is in some sense in the tradition of Jim Scott Seeing Like a State, right? It's about suspicion of central sources of order and a sort of valorization of local sources of order. Right. And then the job of police is to discover that and
or a
enforce
homogenization of sources of order.
What do you mean?
Which is to say that I think Scott would argue that metrics, language, used in one place can easily be extrapolated into other places.
Well, it can,
It's
but
not-
that, right.
It's
well,
not necessarily a
right.
centralization, but it's a flattening. Of,
Right. Well, but again, that's what Scott's against, right?
Yeah,
He's against any of these tools, right? And so in that sense, again, this is also a problem with Scott is Scott wouldn't have liked CompStat, right? He would have looked like a classic rationalism, right? Centralized instrument, right? But and that's one of a book I love, right? But it's a broadside against all of that, right?
we teach that at SPP.
Right. Well, I'm saying the real trick is when, that's a very high potency drug that you want to make sure you're administering only to the patient who needs it, right? And so I would say, there are lots of other forms, right? This is one that's particular. It's about order maintenance. And the question I had for Peter, and I think I was inarticulate when I described it, right, is for doing broken windows policing, the policeman needs to be able to identify who the source of order in the community is. There has to be something where you actually know who it is, right? And you have some relationship, however that relationship, whether it can be more formal, it can be more informal. It can be informal because the people who are policing come out of that orderly source of the community, right? But what happens when actually that informal structure of order that police depend on to give them cues is harder to identify, right? When that breaks down, that seems like that was the issue that I was identifying, right? Is that I think in Wilson's time, he assumed that police would always know what that was, right? That they would be able to know who the source of order was and who they were supposed to defer to, and therefore they could get the authority to do that kind of policing. And that, I guess, I was raising the question is how hard is it to do broken windows policing when it's harder to identify that source of order, whether it may have been in church or some other source than it may have been at a previous time.
So this last panel, looking at some of I thought one of the things that jumped out to me about the last panel was was the role that law and the prosecution of law can also play in this understanding of where those boundaries are, right? We have a law that says that things stolen under $950 are not going to be treated as a felony. We learned, and I didn't know this, that apparently drug offenses are not being prosecuted in Los Angeles County. So we have both law and the discretion of prosecutors, not just police. I wonder what degree you think about those other elements, because it seems like we have police and discretion, we have communities in which they're working, which may have different tolerances and understandings of what constitutes what he would call untended spaces. But we also have the laws as they're set, and we also have the prosecution of those laws.
Although again, I mean, in Wilson, right, there's a very sharp distinction between law enforcement and order maintenance. Maybe it's too sharp, but that's the whole point of the distinction is to say that there's this domain that's separate from law enforcement, right? Sometimes it spills over. Maybe the law enforcement and order maintenance is often like a reserve authority, right? The people know it's there, but when you look at the things that Wilson is talking about, right? And again, when you go back to varieties of police behavior, so much of that is about things where police are just making no recourse to law or enforcement at all, right?
Right.
They're using their own authority, right? They're just like, get off the stoop, right? He's not quoting the law that you're violating, right? Or, move it along or whatever. There's all those things are things that don't have any recourse to law. Now, they assume sort of the authority of the police officer, right? That when somebody tells you to move up off the street, right, that police officer is, in some sense, able to project that legitimate authority. And the idea is that, in some sense, he's doing it as the arm of the orderly part of the community. But again, the thing that broken windows, that concept is really supposed to be focusing us on, is all the things where nobody's making a reference to that. Now, this is where I'm going. The reason I'm going on there is that, at least from the point of view of the police officer, right, it's harder to identify, right, who the source of order is, right? Now, part of that is that a fairly, eccentric part of the community now has a very overblown, thing in the minds of both police officers and media, right? I mean, and that, especially when you think of the black community, which is not a community in the way that Wilson meant. He meant something more local, right? But what we used to think as the orderly component of that community is relatively unorganized, right? That is, the order supporting part of that community is relatively unorganized,
right,
except in things like elections, right? Where it actually turns out to be highly organized,
right, and decisive.
And so I think that's one of the things that you hadn't seen as much in Wilson, is the idea that the police officers, because of now essentially the organization of the disorderly, right? That's one way to think about that, is they are organized, or at least have organized advocates in a way they didn't in the period that Wilson is describing.
What is your take on the two lenses through which one can look at a community through broken windows? One is for the criminal or prospective criminal who sees, as we heard from John's interesting comments before, that criminals will know, hey, this is an area, because of the way it's either policed or the way it's maintained or not maintained, we can do street racing here versus another place. So that's the kind of criminal mindset on where these crimes can be committed based on the so-called broken windows in that community. The other are those who live in that community, and then how they themselves treat it, the law-abiding ones who live in a community with broken windows. I wanted to just quote this one paragraph from that 1982 article and just get your thoughts on this. So this is Wilson and Kelling, we suggest that untended behavior also leads to the breakdown of community controls. A stable neighborhood of families who care for their homes, mind each other's children, and confidently frown upon unwanted intruders can change in a few years or even a few months to inhospitable and frightening jungle. A piece of property is abandoned, weeds grow up, a window is smashed, adults stop scolding rowdy children, the children emboldened become more rowdy, families move out unattached, adults move in, teenagers gather in front of the corner store, and so on. What's your thinking on either the veracity or the reality of both the perspective of the criminal and the community because of this understanding of broken windows?
Well, one thing I'll say, just to go back and put this into context, the thing that strikes me about that passage is how, like, unironically in favor of order and hierarchy it is, right? I mean, that is, also Jim was a good Catholic, and I think had a very lively sense of hierarchy, right? Yep. And one difference, of course, is that lots of other things, right? I mean, that was not a uncommon New Deal Democratic idea, right? That is, the people who were in favor of order and the people who were in favor of the welfare state, right, were often the same people, right? One of the things that's happened is that is our political alignments have sort of disconnected that. I actually think the core of the Democratic Party is still the regular Democrats, not the eccentric professors, not the people on Twitter, right? That the people who vote for Eric Adams, right? They're still that's still what the actual Democratic Party is, right? Not the now again, and I mean by that, I mean Democratic Party voters, ethnic, racial minority voters, right? In every piece of survey research we have, and it goes back to the point that John Wood was making, right, that the median position among African Americans is they want police to show up, and they want police not to beat up their cousin, right? And so that's the double-sided part of it, right? The question really is about how loud that voice of the orderly component is, right? Now, again, I still am skeptical. I mean, again, one thing that's trying to do is trying to make this connection between order maintenance and crime reduction, right? And I'm somewhat suspicious, and I think it's taking us away from the actual question, right? Which is, how important, how valuable do we think order is for its own sake, not just as a thing that leads to reduced crime rates. But the point that you were making that's really interesting, right, is we think that every community just goes back, think of Eli Anderson's work, right, where we think, things about communities as having this dynamic between the decent and the street, right? The relative power of them is going to be dependent in some degree by whether the decent component of the community can call upon the formal authority of the state, right? And that isn't, so that's a channel where their informal authority is partially because people know there's formal authority that can be called upon in a way that the other side cannot, right? So I think that's a plausible theory, right? That is, as the ability of the orderly component to be able to call on formal authority has gone down, then their relative power within that sort of that order maintenance balance in communities may be breaking down. But that's a different channel than criminals saying, oh, we don't go there because they've got their stuff together, right? Which I think which may also be true, but is not really a broken windows pathway to being true or not.
We also had in DC, and I'd like to explore this just for a second. This connection between social science and public policy, between research that happens and implementation on the street, so to speak. This is proposed as a theory. What are your thoughts as a social scientist about the best way that academia can best influence or have their research influence public policy at the local level? Is it through the telling of stories and theory and kind of common sense approaches, if you will? A lot of Wilson's arguments, even though he would back them up with the quantitative piece, were also telling stories where you could read it and say, yeah, that makes sense. How do you as a social scientist think about the best ways in presenting to policymakers to influence the work that they're doing, whatever the field is, whether it's...
I mean, I guess I would say so this gets a little bit to the general point I'm making, which is that, we shouldn't too easily say that the things people were doing was the thing that was in this article, right? That the article caused this other thing, right? I think, there's a few pathways, right? Kelling had influences, as Peter will tell you, and, now the degree to which the thing that he actually believed was the thing that got implemented right through existing organizations with other imperatives is another question, right? Now, again, I think often the most valuable thing we can do is to tell people that things people think are good ideas just aren't, right? I mean, and Jim believed that. That's why Jim actually was, as much as Jim was a very good storyteller and had his own skepticisms of social science, right? He had a long-time relationship with Rand, right? And he really believed that idea that, that we need to rigorously evaluate public policies because people can tell lots of stories, right? And then eventually we need to know whether those stories, which may be very emotionally resonant, right, actually work the way that they're implied to, right? And again, one danger of this is it's such a powerful metaphor, right? In a way, it's such an incredible, it's a very well written, it's a beautifully written piece.
It is.
Like everything Jim read, it was very beautiful, right? But in a way, I think that, the fact that it was can sometimes convince you that he knew more about, especially when he makes that pivot, when he makes the order to crime pivot in the piece, right? That those two parts should not have equal authority, right? The idea that doing the kind of policing he was talking about, right? And again, the other thing I would simply say is, when people talk about broken windows, they often again talk about New York City as the entity that was the moral community, right? That they were the police were out there enforcing, community norms, right? And I think some of the question is whether they were enforcing, something else. They were enforcing a majoritarian set of norms, which is different than what he was talking about, right? Now, it may be that the point that New York was when they start doing this, right, that New York actually needed centralization. It needed...
We had years of over 2,000 murders.
I mean, it needed centralized administrative control.
Yeah.
It needed, right? But again, that was all, in some sense, doing something very different than what Wilson thought he was calling for, right? So then, again, in retrospect, I think this often provided rhetorical support, right? One story people tell is they say, oh, this provided rhetorical support from some horrible thing, right? My maybe more ironic thing is I think it provided rhetorical support for lots of things that in fact were very good, but were not the thing that was actually being endorsed in this article.
Right.
So.
I want to open it up to questions, but I just want to drill down on this. Peter's interesting reference in speaking to Kelling, seeing the connection between the broken windows theory and Jane Jacobs' work, right? And again, not a social scientist herself, but describe the behavior in cities in ways that has been both critiqued and furthered and promoted and attacked, but this way of understanding the organic and local nature of communities, again, going back to how social scientists can best communicate and influence policy, that ability to be a storyteller. How important do you think that?
Well, I mean, I certainly think in my experience, right, that some of the most important things I've done have not necessarily been the most deeply researched. I hate to say this, right? I wrote this piece called "Clogocracy: The American Way of Policy," which is a piece I like a lot. If I actually told you how many on-the-job hours I put into that, compared to my book Prison Break, right, which was involved tons and tons of interviews and deep research, right, but that piece sort of picked on a zeitgeist, right? There was a thing that a lot of people were aware of, right?
And a great title.
And a great title,
like Broken Windows.
Right?
I mean,
but I mean, that piece was totally accidental that it came out. Mike Lind, who I've told you about a number of times, right, had some money left over in a grant, and he told me if I finished it in 2 weeks, he'd give me all the rest of the money in the grant. So I said, all right, I'll do that, right? But I think it worked, not necessarily, in a way, that piece is not, in some ways, not unlike this, right?
Yeah.
In that it was mainly synthetic. It was not based on my original research. And again, the parts of Jim that I love the most are some of these really deep, things like in political organizations or rise of police behavior that are based on real field work, right? Real serious field work. But some of that is just that ability to sort of catch what the zeitgeist is, right? That what is it that people really want to know? They want some answer. They want somebody to be able to tell them what they can do, right? And remember, in 1982, and I grew up in D.C., right? And so 1982, I would have been 14 years old, right? And I cannot tell you the degree of just despair we had about D.C., right? We thought it was never, ever going. We thought it was just going to keep going down.
Well, you and I went to GW at the same time when D.C. was the murder capital of the country.
It was, right? And again, there were lots of, we would not go east of 16th Street.
Right.
We would not go north of T, right? And I remember when I graduated from college, somebody was like, oh, let's go meet in a bar at 14th and U. And I was like, what the hell are you talking about? I thought there'd be dragons, right? And so one thing about this piece, right, is it hit at a moment when people were unbelievably pessimistic, right? They were deeply pessimistic. And one thing to say about this piece is whatever its vices or virtues were, right, this was a piece that said that something can be done, right? There is a thing, right, we can name the problem, we can, and there's a direction if you go in. Now again, I would say I don't believe that is in fact what we did, right? But just giving people optimism that something can be done, right? That we can name a problem, that people can create collective action around it, right? Some of that sort of collective, one thing these articles do is they give people a sense of collective agency, right? And not having, and again, I saw a lot of pessimism here in this room today, and I think some of it was actually not warranted because we actually know a lot more now. We know a huge amount more now about what actually durably reduces crime, right?
But isn't the difference now is that it seems to be the hurdles are not so much awareness and data, but ideology?
Right. Well, again, I think part of it is, so I'll say that the proudest thing I did, so this thing is I'm actually a professor at Johns Hopkins and a senior fellow at the Niskanen Center. And my proudest thing I did at the Niskanen Center is right after the George Floyd, and when that suddenly seemed like it was totally turning everything around and everyone's perceptions of what we had to believe were different. I helped commission an article by Mike Fortner, the political scientist who's down at Claremont McKenna, just to do a basic survey of African Americans' opinion on crime and criminal justice, right? And again, the findings were not that surprising, right? It's that African Americans want basically what the same everything else wants, right? They're relatively, they're more working class Americans. They want protection from crime, and they want, again, they don't want it. But unlike most white Americans, they are more likely to believe that they could be subjected to illegitimate police violence, and they just don't. They want both. They deserve both, right? And the point is, that was just to say, here is a thing that everybody actually knows, and everyone's acting like they don't, right? And I think one thing that's happening is that relatively eccentric group, right? The people we think around defund and all of that, right, are an incredibly small group of people, right, who have an incredibly magnified sense of power, right?
Or do they have a magnified sense of impact?
Well, people have thought they had to pay attention to them, right?
And people did, right?
Well, people did, right? But again, if you think about what was, if you go back to 2020, right? I remember this, right, at during the primary election, everybody but Joe Biden was running as if they had to win that sort of primary for the most eccentric people on criminal justice. And Biden was just like, no, I'm just not going to do that. Right, I'm just going to, because I think Biden actually knew where the actual center of the Democratic Party was, and it wasn't just these people who nobody had heard of 6 months before.
But isn't that what also makes the problem at the city level magnified, right? I understand what you're saying about Biden's appeal to that broad swath of the Democratic Party, yet we have DAs like Gascon, who is obviously an ideologue in LA, what we had with Chesa Boudin up in San Francisco, what we have in Philadelphia, where you're looking at, for these municipal elections, 15 to 20% turnout, and a pretty rabid ideological base, if you will, can really swing elections.
Well, this is where, again, I think that's an organizational problem, right? Again, often, right, when Chesa Boudin was actually put up on the ballot, and more than a really small group of people were making that decision was made differently. When you actually look at, when the actual voters in New York had to decide between whether they wanted, for example, Eric Adams or Maya Wiley, right? They picked Eric Adams, right? In general, that's where most of those regular voters. Now, I do think there's
in Chicago they didn't.
In Chicago they didn't, but I do think there's a durable problem, and I've written about this in other areas, right? Which is that in general, normal, relatively unattentive voters are not well organized in American politics, right? Now, that was not always the case, right? That is, one of the advantages of the older machine politics thing, right? Is precisely because it was mobilizing people into politics for material interests, is it had a way to bring the actual views of non-eccentric people into politics, right? And again, I think there's still the remnant of that in the actual voter base of the Democratic Party. But a lot of the problems we're seeing in crime are the result of the fact that we haven't figured out a way to really durably organize normal voters, right? Especially outside of elections, right? Elections are where their power is the most magnified, right? It's between elections, right, where things like who's actually organized, who can actually, publish op-eds and who can actually lobby and who can bring lawsuits, right? All those other forms of power where the more ideologically eccentric matter more, right? Matter in between elections.
So I'm just going to maybe respond on that one note, and then I want to open it up. We have some time here for questions. I would argue the reason why the so-called normal voter is not being organized is because the tectonic plates are shifting underneath the parties themselves. So we're seeing a fundamental restructuring of what it means to be a Democrat and Republican right now. And in the midst of that restructuring, there's not really a lot of organization. And so you have a mayor of Dallas in Eric Johnson who's switching parties because, in part because of some of these issues where he was treated by Democratic activists on the defund the police thing, where it may have been a small group of people, but all of them were showing up on his lawn and all of them were critiquing the job he was doing until, at least the way that he tells the story, he got to a point where he said, as Reagan once said, I didn't leave the Democratic Party left me. And I wonder if that's at least part of why we're seeing some of these outcomes with like Democratic socialists being elected to the LA City Council, something that would never have happened, 10, 15 years ago. And some of these DAs that are being elected in major cities, which again, when you look at their approach to issues around crime and criminal justice, are pretty far outside the mainstream.
Well, again, I think that, so one, the relative low level of organization of ordinary people is a much longer phenomenon, right? In some ways, right, we used to have lots of ways to bring the opinions of ordinary people into politics, right? Not just through parties that were organized more through material, right, thing than ideological.
Unions,
but we had, my friend Theda Scotchwell has written all this about national federated organizations, right? Those are the Garden Clubs, the Lions, and the Rotary, right? Those were lots of things, right? All the way, and those went all the way down the class level, right? And we've seen sort of a systematic deterioration of that, a systematic deterioration of unions, right? Which are not as probably as popular in this room as they might be in other rooms, right? But unions have become have fallen back into mostly in the public sector, not in the private sector anymore, right? Those are ways to bring the relatively non-eccentric views of ordinary voters into politics, right? And so we've sort of dismantled all of those forms, right? And it's not a surprise that that what we've got left are people who are motivated mainly by ideology on both sides, right? Because we've taken out all the other forms of organization that can bring people into politics.
Very good. Let's open up to questions. Yes, Peter.
Thanks. If I could just ask your indulgence to give a comment and not a question. I know that's a bad thing, but it very much relates to your closed reading. I wanted to add to the idea of how academics affect public policy. The broken windows, first of all, it had the Atlantic magazine, which was more respected at the time. It had that, the message went through a certain median, mainstream, I don't know, center-left, kind of, but this
Intellectual thought,
intellectual magazine, so that gave it credence. Bryant Park in New York was one of the first openly, this is now before 1990. Dan Biederman around the business improvement district. I love this article. I'm going to do broken windows in Bryant Park. But George Kelling, I approached the Atlantic magazine. It was after Ferguson, but it was when George Kelling was still alive. And I said, let's write an update to Broken Windows. You're worried about your legacy. I just kind of want a Kelling and Moscow's piece. And I had contacts at the Atlantic, and I mentioned that data point that blacks want more policing more than whites want more policing, and they also want better policing. And there was an editor at the Atlantic, and I never met her or saw her, but I believe she was a young white college-educated woman, and she simply didn't believe it. I don't think people knew this. And we had an email exchange back and forth that ended up being like 20,000 words. I compiled it. And the article actually didn't happen for other reasons. But I think it's that they don't know. That's all it is.
Was it, they don't know? Again, I've written actually a fair amount about motivated cognition, and it's a pretty powerful thing, right? People have a lot of mechanisms to avoid information that's inconsistent with their overall right, view of the world, right? And in some sense, right, this is I mean, I hate coming to things and talking to conservatives and telling them universities are bad, because I come from universities, and I want to say things are, that universities are good. And also, I should say, I have lots of really smart students, right, who want to learn things and want to know things, right, and don't have this really strong structure, right, of motivated cognition. They end up in my classes because they want to be surprised or challenged or whatever. Those people still very much exist. They're also unorganized, right? Nobody, my conservative students are amazingly organized, right? They're always being invited to come to things and go to the beach and, and be given honoraria, right? My middle of the roadie students, right, just know they're like they are literally the invisible man of campus, right? But I think part of this is a result of the fact that universities just are different than they had been, right? And when I think about Harvard, right? Harvard in 1982 had Nathan Glazer, Sam Huntington, Harvey Mansfield, and this is just like, in one very small part of the university, right? I could keep going through, right? There were a bunch of people, right? That as you would had a very hard time just going through your whole life at Harvard and not having been exposed at least to some of these ideas that would have challenged your priors, right? And it wouldn't necessarily convinced you, right? But you would have had to be like, oh, I really need to, this information was in fact available, right? And I do think that a little bit of the fact that we have had sort of the disappearing conservative professor, as far as I can tell at Hopkins, there's not a single one in humanities or social science, right? So I keep getting asked to do these things. I'm like, I'm a liberal Democrat, man. Why do you keep asking me to do this job? And they're like, you're the best we could get. So I do think there's something to the idea that they don't know, but it's also that we built a lot of things that make it like emotionally very hard to attend to information that violates, right, this sort of way of life that people have picked up, this sort of, anyways.
I just want to piggyback on that too, and I didn't know we were going in the direction of academia, but I've told this story before, and he has written a couple searing journal pieces on this, but Tyler Vanderweel is an epidemiologist, teaches at the Harvard School of Public Health, and has come out recently talking about the trials and tribulations that he went through earlier this year when a group of students saw that he had written, contributed to an amicus brief in the Obergefell ruling back in 2015, really based on social science, but demanded that the dean overturn his tenure. Now, this is part and parcel of a larger movement, apparently by the School of Public Health, not to research in particular areas. So the subject of what are the psychological implications for women who have an abortion, for example, that was not going to be something that was going to be funded or supported. And I just say that to say that these areas around what academia is bringing us as far as research, particularly in the social sciences, I think we really need to be focused on this as an issue where ideology is becoming increasingly, Vanderweel's recent article about the problems within the discipline of public health due to ideology is a really disturbing piece by a very thoughtful scholar that I'm afraid is bleeding across the social science.
But also, just really quickly on this, I also think in some ways this is a real problem for conservatives, right? In their example, it's like, I always use the example, it's like, everyone points and says, oh, the person who's creating our problems is woke Smith girl, right? So Peters is a little bit like woke Smith girl. She ended up at the Atlantic and I couldn't get my piece published, right? But the fact that conservatives often now operate in an almost analytic free zone, right? That social science is largely viewed as entirely corrupted, right? And in fact, especially even in criminal justice, right? There's tons of really important, really solid criminal justice done by normal scholars, right? And again, in much of which, people who are saying things like we need to bring back 3 strikes and we need to go back to sort of, long sentences, right? There's as good evidence as there is in anything, right? That increasing severity like that just doesn't reduce crime, right? And it's not even something you have to even have done all the econometric studies on. You just need to have a basic idea of human nature, right? That if you're really committing crime, the idea that you're going to incorporate a cost 30 years out in the future, right? But the number of conservatives who act as entirely innocent of that whole body of knowledge, right? That's a problem for conservatives too, right? And so I think the fact that the university in some ways is pulled away from conservatives is a problem because what's left, it can go without being fear of having people ask annoying questions. But it also is the fact that conservatism is worse because there aren't scholars like Jim, right, who could say there's lots of Rand analysis that says that thing that sounds emotionally good to you just isn't true.
That's at least in part why we're doing what we're doing at the policy school, especially when we send students into PhD programs, is to be that way station before they go on for PhD programs. Others? Yes, Matt.
I'm just wondering, we've talked a lot about broken Windows theory, but to me, the thing that seems to be the most broken seems to be how we're getting messages to people and really the two parties themselves, right? You've just talked about how you feel like the right's controlled by the ultra-right and how the left's controlled by the ultra-progressive left, when most of the people are more towards the middle. And I'm wondering if this isn't getting back to when we talk about communities, how we need to kind of police ourselves. I know if this was 20 years ago, I know Dianne Feinstein just passed, but 20 years ago, if she was in her state she was for the last 6 months to a year, they would have removed her from all the committees. They would have helped push her. Her own party would have helped push her out of the way because it's like, you're not catching on to what's going on. Same on the Republican side, when someone oversteps, Mitch McConnell's had a couple of episodes. It would have been, maybe you need to take a break. Let's push you to the side. We still respect you, but you got to take a step back while we have others taking over. And my fear is that we're letting these two crazy silos of each entity that want to push to the extremes provide all the messaging. So I'm one of those few people who works on social media quite a bit. You see all my friends' postings. And I've got friends on the Republican and on the Democrat side. And the Democrats all say the same thing over and over and over again. They're in this silo. And all the Republicans are all in this silo. And they keep repeating the same thing over and over and over again. Where the majority of us are in between the two of the extremes. And I'm just wondering, this almost feels more broken than even kind of our broken theory. Windows theory.
Well, I think so. Again, I'm involved in the Niskanen Center, which is a think tank in D.C. Then we have a criminal justice program, which is actually quite unusual in that it's focused mostly on crime. Now, trying to affect crime in ways that actually exacerbate incarceration as little as possible. But again, crime reduction and crime control is the thing we focus on, right? And again, this is a problem with Twitter. I was actually hoping that Elon Musk taking over Twitter would actually just lead it to completely melt down, and it's going there. But when the people there actually talk, again, to normal Republicans, most Democrats, most Republicans, when they talk to them in their offices, behind closed doors, right, they basically are relatively normal people, right? They are people who have normal moral intuitions, which is the thing I was going back to before, which is that you want to reduce crime at the lowest level of sadism possible, right? And that is the normal position of 80% of the American public, which is lots of these are about balancing, right? They're about how do you actually find the tools that don't exacerbate incarceration, right? In that case, my position is, right, that's police, that's parole, that's probation, right? Everything you can do other than police, right, has to work a lot harder, right? And policymakers are very open to that, right? And when they can make decisions sort of behind closed doors, they can make it in what Matt Iglesias called sort of the secret Congress, when they're doing things out of the normal pattern, right? They can do that. Now, the question is, how would we make that more salient? How would we make it easier for them to make policy in that normal mode aimed at people of normal moral intuitions, right? And again, Twitter's the worst thing for that, because Twitter's all about sloganeering. It's all about making moral points at each other. And you can't actually make an analytical point on Twitter. You can't really be able to go down the rabbit hole of what the evidence for drug courts is or whatever, right? Mm-hmm. And that's where I think, one, we need to rebuild those kind of institutions where we can. And the other thing I would say is, and this goes back to the party point, I do think one thing that's happening in our parties is they are becoming more durably factionalized, right? We went through a period in which the parties were unusually unified, right? And increasingly, I think in part because, right, of the pressure in the Democratic Party on its far left, right? People toward the center, right, are starting to organize. I know people in San Francisco who are trying to basically organize normies in San Francisco in the Democratic Party. And I think similar trends are not quite as far along in the Republican Party as the primary seems to be suggesting. But I think that is certainly happening in the Democratic Party. And one of those dimensions of differentiation unquestionably is going to be crime, right? And that's going to be the thing on which a sort of more moderate Democratic faction ends up differentiating itself. And that's where, again, the overwhelming percentage of actual voters are. And that organization is the thing that's going to be able to make that more politically salient.
But this goes back to my point. I agree with you on the factionalization of issues. What hasn't been, where the dust has not settled, is on the factionalization of actual voters. Where are the voters going to go? How many of the former Democrats, which I'm seeing happening, how many of them are going to either switch to independent or to the Republican Party? How many of the Republican voters, usually along class lines, at least that's what we seem to be seeing, going to switch over to the Democratic Party? And so I don't think it's so much unorganized as disorganized right now. And I think that's going to be meted out over elections as candidates step forward and represent certain sets of issues. But I totally agree. I think these so-called quality of life issues, education, obviously, and what's I think so interesting right now is what we're beginning to see politically are issues that really are local issues being turned into issues at the national party level, right? So you look at a Glenn Youngkin and you look at where Republicans are on education. Certainly some of that is ideological, but some of that is also policy related. The crime issue as well, generally a local issue, but it's being made part of as it has been in the past, right? I mean, you know, certainly presidential candidates in the past have made crime a national issue. I just think what's disorganized now is where those voters are going to come from and sort themselves out. We have time for a couple more questions, if we have any. That's fine too. Yes.
I just want to say, in Los Angeles, the unions are so organized. So recently, 120,000 hotel workers pushed a measure onto the ballot saying we had to take homeless into the hotels. So I'm sort of wondering, is democracy broken when you have super organized factions like the unions that are just giant voting blocks, and then you have what you call the unorganized normies? You know, how are we going to shake out in the next election?
Again, I think it comes back to that point that we have not, I mean, as we've gotten sort of lower and lower levels of engagement of ordinary citizens, right? Whatever's left, whoever actually has that residual capacity to organize and actually do something and actually get people to, you know, to show up, right? You know, politics is you know, 80% about who shows up. And in some sense, right, by historical measures, right, that would not necessarily be considered that unbelievable amount of people, right? But it is only because we haven't figured out a way to organize people on any other basis, right? You know, people would often be organized by faith community, they'd be organized by lots of other kind of things, right? And we've lost that. And that's where, again, I want to go back to the point where I was challenging Peter on, right? It feels like a lot of that informal structure of society on which formal part depends, right? The more that phrase, right? One, you get problems of social disorder that end up becoming crime, and then you end up getting problems of essentially capture by whoever's got the residual left of organization, right? And again, it's in both both parties, right? Republican Party, when you take down, right, the Republican Party used to be sort of the party of relatively normal, people who thought of themselves in that way, right? Not eccentric, right? Not having particularly unusual views, right? And now, or when you go down, when those people are no longer organized, right? What you've got left are gun owners, people with particularly eccentric religious views, right? They're the one, again, who all deserve to be represented in politics, right? But those are the residual parts that still have some way to organize, right? And to me, that's the great challenge in American politics, right? Is how do you actually find counterweights? How do you find new ways to organize people? And, John Wood's not here, right? He's trying to organize them in one particular way. But if you don't, right, then the few people who can actually do it are the ones who politicians are going to pay the greatest attention to. And I would say the last thing is political parties are about the best counterweight you can possibly have, right? Because they are ways to actually at least potentially organize people who don't have as intense a material interest in a way that unions or gun owners or other people do, right? And we need to find ways to sort of rebuild them as mechanisms for sort of mass participation.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Steve Tellis. Well, thank you all for spending this afternoon with us. I hope you have enjoyed this series of conversations. I know I have. As I often say at the end of our conferences, the vast majority of people who will end up seeing our conferences actually will be watching them online. And part of the way that we spread the word about the conferences and the videos of them is when within the next few days you all are going to be getting links to the conference videos and that you promote them far and wide. I've spoken with a few people who are connected to some amazing networks of people who are interested in these sets of issues. And I think what we were able to do today is really explore them in thoughtful ways that I think we need to promote widely. And so, again, just watch your email in the next few days as you get these video links, and please promote them. Again, I want to thank my friend Howard Amundsen and our friends at Fieldstead for the support of this. Please join me in giving another round of applause for them. Thank you, Howard. We have already teed up our next event. Will be in the spring, supported by Fieldstead. It's on the very non-contentious issue of homelessness. So we look forward to letting you know about that. It's probably going to be in March, but it's going to be here in the Los Angeles area, and obviously something that was touched on a couple of these panels, but will be explored in some more detail then. So until then, thanks so much for joining us, and we will stay in touch. God bless.